poet is a poet because he understands, because he is born with a divine kinship with all things, and he is a poet in direct ratio to his power of sympathy. At the World's Columbian Exposition, 21-year-old Paul Laurence Dunbar works as a clerk in the Haitian Pavilion. There, he meets one of his idols, Frederick Douglass, who was speaking at the fair. With a life spanning the Civil War, Douglass experienced both slavery and freedom. He became one of the most prominent abolitionists and black writers of his time. As an African-American writer himself, the young Dunbar admired Douglass for his literary contributions. This included the acclaimed autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. At the World's Fair, Douglass recognizes the young writer and asks Dunbar to read one of his poems, Ode to Ethiopia. For Dunbar, this moment is pivotal. One of the most influential black men in America encourages Dunbar to pursue his writing in the face of institutionalized racism.
Douglass goes to Dunbar, and Dunbar is a kind of intermediate figure that sort of links the sort of slavery past with the sort of more modern Harlem Renaissance.
Born in 1872, just 9 years after emancipation, Dunbar entered the first generation of free African Americans. His father, Joshua Dunbar, escaped from Kentucky during the Civil War via the Underground Railroad. He went on to volunteer in the Massachusetts 55th Infantry Regiment, one of the first all-black units to fight in the U.S. Matilda, Paul's mother, was also a slave in Kentucky and moved to Dayton with Joshua after emancipation. She consistently advocated for Paul's education and recognizing his potential for success. The only African American in his high school, Paul graduated at the top of his class. In addition, he was popular among his classmates, one of whom was his good friend Orville Wright. Yet despite his achievement in school, he found his future prospects disappointing compared to white students of similar accomplishment. While hoping to attend law school, Dunbar begrudgingly took work as an elevator attendant in his hometown, the only job offer he could obtain. This disenchantment manifested in his heightened awareness of the struggles African Americans now faced despite being free. Dunbar's proximity to slavery and his experience of racism became the palette he used to craft poetry. This work eventually led to his literary success. Scholars debate over the extent to which Dunbar's writing enforced or subverted racial stereotypes of African Americans. Central to this debate are Dunbar's dialect pieces, poems written in a vernacular associated with Southern blacks during the time of slavery. Dunbar wrote during the popularity of the plantation tradition. Authors such as Thomas Nelson Page and Joel Chandler Harris romanticized slavery, portraying the plantation as a place of peaceful coexistence between slaves and owners. In relation to this type of racialized writing, Dunbar wrote with a double consciousness. This term, coined by writer and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, refers to the tension experienced by black individuals that involves an awareness of their identity as both black and American. They see themselves through the eyes of the white oppressor while trying to establish their own voice in the U.S. Dunbar attempted to succeed in a literary world dominated by whites while still speaking to this disenfranchised black audience. At the turn of the 20th century, one particularly influential voice was that of William Dean Howells, known as the Dean of American Letters. Howells was a well-known editor, critic, and publisher who took a particular interest in Dunbar's work. The attention Howells gave Dunbar certainly helped increase Dunbar's readership, yet Howells's praise carried a racist edge to it.
It seems to me now that there is a precious difference between the races which it would be a great pity ever to lose, and that this is best preserved and most charmingly suggested by Mr. Dunbar in those pieces of his where he studies the moods and traits of his race in its own accent of our spoken English. They are not really dialects so much as delightful personal attempts and failures for the written and spoken language.
This attitude exemplified the white supremacy prevalent in the country and in the realm of literature at the time. In the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, Dunbar's popularity among black artists decreased significantly. As black writers and musicians worked to achieve artistic success, many found dialect poems counterproductive. In 1922, James Weldon Johnson published the Book of American Negro Poetry. In it, Johnson praises Dunbar's standard English poetry as example, but describes his dialect poems as outdated. Modernist Wallace Thurman denoted Dunbar as a minor bard, and Ralph Ellison, a prominent black intellectual and author of the acclaimed novel Invisible Man, blamed Dunbar for engaging with white stereotypes of African Americans and fueling the circulation of these racist notions. However, in the politically charged era of the Harlem Renaissance, which attempted to promote the success of black artistry, the complex irony of Dunbar's writing may have been overlooked. It was not until the late 20th century when African American scholars such as Henry Louis Gates defined the technique of signifying. Signifying refers specifically to African American writing that engages with racial stereotypes of blacks, but uses the language of their oppressors to subvert and reclaim power.
Signifying is really involved sort of irony. It's a way of taking a verbal, just in its simplest form, taking a verbal utterance, borrowing it, reworking it, and reconfiguring its meaning and significance, even as you also seem to be saying what the thing itself originally said. So you could think of it as a kind of revision with a difference. You can also think of it as speaking back, in some very specific instances, sort of speaking back to power using the language of power, but doing it ironically.
Little brown baby with sparkling eyes. Come to your pappy. Sat on his knee. Huh? Well, what you been doing, son? Huh? Making sand pies? Look at that bill. Why, he was as dirty as me.
Outside of a more elite crowd, Dunbar remained consistently popular in the greater African American population. For example, Joanne Braxton, an African American woman and renowned Dunbar scholar, has always considered his poetry a central part of her life. Her parents recited Dunbar's poetry to Braxton throughout her entire childhood. Later, in her career as an educator, she was disappointed to find no satisfactory collection of Dunbar's poetry for her students. So, she decided to anthologize Dunbar's work herself. As a result, she edited the collected poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, published in 1993. Dunbar's work leaves behind a complicated legacy, one filled with both controversy and admiration. As contemporary audiences study his poetry, new circumstances will reveal new insights into Dunbar's work, some flattering, others critical. The voices of his readers and critics, both past and present, provide us with a nuanced appreciation of Dunbar's achievements.
It is a little dark still, but there are warnings of the day, and somewhere out of the darkness a bird is singing to the dawn.